Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
Campus Reform's Nicholas Giordano is with me now. Why would anyone be okay with a government camera in their house?
Well, it's due to a failed education system that hasn't actually educated students on the importance of American history and our God-given rights and liberties. Unfortunately, we see real-world examples. So during the coronavirus pandemic, the young Americans didn't question the lockdowns, the mask and vaccine mandates, the school closures, and it inhibited their learning and social growth. So you see the examples of that. And I have students, 86% of them can't distinguish between the American Constitution and the Russian Constitution. Unfortunately, it actually gets worse on the college campuses because you have free speech zones that think that they could relegate the First Amendment to little campus geographical boxes. And then you have bias reporting systems. In campus reform, we've been reporting heavily on these bias reporting systems where students make frivolous complaints about opinions that they deem offensive. And you have professors coming out saying, hey, this is an attack on our First Amendment.
But young folks live on screens, live with cameras. And some of them presumably want cameras from the government in their homes for security reasons. Do you think that's valid?
Well, if we look at the bias reporting systems, because I think it's the great example. I mean, and again, we go to a pandemic. You had the governor of Oregon talking about how residents should inform and rat out other residents that are violating any COVID rules. We saw the same thing here in New York City. So what you're saying is an entire generation growing up thinking that government is the be-all, end-all, that government is something that they should be obedient and compliant to, where in American values, we respect government, but we question government and governmental powers. They seem to think, the younger generations, that government's the answer to everything.
Of course, it is traditional that older folks, like myself, look at the younger generation and are critical. Every older generation is critical of the younger generation, and this is no different.
It's no different, and to a certain degree. However, if we bury our heads in the sand and ignore this, the trend actually gets worse. Orwell's 1984 comes closer to reality. And we have to do two simple things. One, fix the education system. Make history and civics separate courses. Make them mandatory from 9th grade to 12th grade so they could actually pass a citizenship exam. And then at the college level, we need to start looking at cutting the funding. Any university, any institution that is going to deny people their First Amendment rights, that's going to violate our Constitution, why should taxpayers have to fund something like that? Those two simple things can actually go a long way in reversing this trend and bringing that 29% of Gen Zers maybe down to about 5%.
Well, I don't think we're going to have government cameras in private homes, but we do have those things called Nest, is it, or other cameras that are up there?
All those other cameras. But I would say prior to 2020, I may agree with that. However, after seeing everything that took place during the pandemic, I'm really concerned that there's so many people that just blindly obey without asking questions.
Interesting. Nicholas Giordano, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Matters sometimes more than the grades and everything else, or it could be the coup de grace here. In other words, that would be the thing that would determine whether you get into a school or not. So what do you put in those essays to sort of influence an Ivy League school or top college to consider you? Enter Nicholas Giordano, Suffolk Community College professor. Let me ask you about that, Professor. If the focus now is on these essays that a lot of kids write as they put their applications together for college, you don't have to say you're a minority. You can say about your journey and what got you here and make a reference to that where there's an understanding that you're not using race, but you're using the experience, maybe inclusive of race, to get some special attention. Is that so wrong, and does that really change?
Well, you're right. It creates this backdoor approach, but we have to understand that race-based admissions is insulting because it insinuates that minorities can't compete with their counterparts. I've been teaching at a community college for nearly 20 years, and 50% of my students are minorities, and they perform just as well as white and Asian counterparts. And we need to stop with the racism of low expectations, because that's what these race-based initiatives do. They have such a low opinion. So we need to refocus at the college level back on the idea of merit and scholarship. if we continue down the path where race is going to be the deciding factor, well, then we diminish the value of a college education. We diminish the value of our own profession. And this isn't the 1960s America that they pretend we're living in.
You know, though, Professor, the only reason why I started with that question to you is that is going to be the means by which I glean from Harvard's response to this, that they will judge, future students and whether they're admitted or not, and that the essay plays an important role, and that essay is an opportunity for someone to talk about their life experiences, maybe to infer, special, race conditions, if you will, that is something that no doubt the Supreme Court will to keep track of the number of kids accepted at the schools and on what basis they were accepted. But if you don't see a marked change in the number or types of students accepted, what does this mean? Does the Supreme Court start saying, wait a minute, you're not listening to us? In other words, how does it enforce this?
Well, that's going to be the challenge, because we are going to see, I know how college administrators work, and we are going to see this subtle approach to put more weight on college essays, especially at a time where you see more and more colleges moving away from things like standardized tests that the Leadership Institute's Campus Forum has been reporting on. So we do have to pay attention. I don't think the battle's over. I think that we are going to see challenges to the SCOTUS's decision. I think colleges are going to try and use this as a backdoor attempt. However, I don't think it's necessarily going to work, because we just look at the last census. The last census showed that minorities, particularly Black and Hispanic college enrollment, has increased dramatically compared to what it was. And that's why I say we're living in 2023. So the reality becomes that we are seeing more people engaged on college campuses, going to college. And it's not about race anymore. We have to factor in and return to principles that academia used to stand for.
So, Professor, then how will the court, and not that it's the police mechanism, how will this be followed up? In other words, if they still see, Asian student acceptance rate is still low at 3% or what have you, and all the other groups remain roughly as they have been, isn't the Supreme Court going to come back and say, wait a minute, you're not listening to us, what we said here?
Well, I think if the percentages stay the same, you can't necessarily make the argument that that's a sign that nothing's changed in the admissions practice. I think what you're going to have to wait and see, is if those that are outperforming their peers are then still rejected based on being Asian or white.
But they're never going to say that. The schools are never going to say that.
They'll never say it out loud.
Right? Yeah.
But we will see students bring more lawsuits.
Got it. Professor, very good seeing you. Thank you for helping us out today.
Thank you for having me.
Listen up, P.A.S. report audience. Experts say that China is hoarding a massive amount of food. They're soon going to have over 2/3 of the globe's corn reserves, over half its rice reserves, and over half its wheat reserves. But when asked about it, China lies. And one expert says that they, of course, will never admit to doing something like that. Well, what does China know that we don't? When it comes to the global food shortages, China is the canary in the coal mine. And you have to understand, China is the world's #1 food importer. They rely on the rest of the world to keep their people fed, so they can't afford to mess up. There'll be riots, civil panic, or even worse, when over 1 billion people can't eat. It's going to create a crisis for them. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for Americans like me and you? Food shortages. That's why it's a smart idea to stock up on a kit of the best-selling 4 Patriot Survival Food. Create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4 Patriot Survival Food kits. It's hand-packed in the United States. The kits are compact, stock easily. They have different delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and I can attest to that because I use 4 Patriots, and their 5-star reviews on the website rave about the flavor and taste. Right now, you can get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriot Survival Food by typing in the code PAS at checkout. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriot Survival Food. That's 4patriots.com. Use code PAS.
I'm going to bring in now Suffolk Community College professor Nicholas Giordano. Nicholas, what's your reaction to the ruling? I think at the very heart of this is that Joe Biden just doesn't have the authority to make this kind of decision, wiping out all of this debt. What's your reaction?
Well, I'm not surprised by the decision. It went how I anticipated. But even with this decision, it still doesn't tackle the real problem, which is the high cost of college education. And that is largely attributed to the government that got involved in the student loan business, as well as the idea of just pushing 4-year university bachelor degrees. I teach at a community college. I talk to my students. And my students chose community college because it's fiscally responsible. It's a viable alternative. And we need to stop pretending that the only solution to a successful life is a 4-year degree, where we have trade schools, we have community colleges, and students could go out, they could start their own business. There are viable solutions to have a successful career, and I'm the product of a community college, and I've been successful too.
Very good. So, Nicholas, I guess my next question, we've been kicking this about, is what happens from here? We're expecting the president to maybe come out with an alternative plan to try and get around this. I mean, how do you see this playing out?
Well, Speaker Pelosi said that the president didn't have the authority. Democrats were in agreement that he didn't have authority. Now they want to do some backdoor attempt to try and give him the authority to do this. But the truth of the matter is, again, it does nothing to solve the real problem of high tuition costs. And if Democrats put in as much effort as trying to find some backdoor attempts to actually fixing the real problem.
Well, I think we lost you. Did we lose you, Nicholas? Are you still there?
Canceling student loans isn't the solution. We need to make sure that we don't encourage this sense of entitlement within the student body.
Yeah, and this is a major plank in his platform, Nicholas. And so we had a reporter earlier today who said, look, there's a 1965 Education Act that basically says that the Education Department has the authority to wipe out student debt. I wasn't aware of that. That's one of those weird aside things. But if the administration tries to use something like that, I would imagine we're just going to be straight back in court again, right?
Correct. We start at square one. It will go through the court system. It will certainly be challenged.
Interesting. Interesting. So do you think this is getting resolved anytime soon? Because it's very likely that the administration is going to try and come up with a, to your point, backdoor deal.
Well, I think that what we need to do is start looking at why companies and municipalities like Pennsylvania and Virginia are moving away from college degree requirements. And I think that right there tells us that there's not enough value anymore in the 4-year university system where people are seeking alternatives.
And that's a positive thing, to your point, Nicholas. People pony up an awful lot of money, and what I want to know is, what's that money paying for? Is it for long-term tenured professors who are on big salaries? I mean, it's gotten, quite frankly, out of hand. Would you agree?
I would certainly agree. College tuition has increased 168% in the last 30 years. And now you have colleges and institutions requiring degree requirements of diversity, equity, and inclusion in every major you could think of. So people are reconsidering their approach. And as the leadership at Student Campus Reform, we've been reporting on the useless college classes like adulting, the right to be lazy. I mean, why should the taxpayers be responsible to pay for students to take those types of courses?
You're absolutely right. Let me stay there if you can, Nicholas, very quickly. I want to bring Edward Lawrence in again. Edward, we are getting the sense we will hear from the president, whether it's a statement or we're going to see him in person. Do you know how soon that could happen? Are we looking at noon, somewhere in there, or maybe early afternoon?
Yeah, Ashley, it is hard to hear. I am not hearing your show at the moment on this, but I did want to say that there's a little bit more from the argument on this. Justice Roberts rejects the arguments by both the Biden administration and in the dissent that this was precisely the kind of program that Congress intended when it enacted the HEROES Act. So obviously they are coming at this related to where the authority lies to do this. Now, Roberts, again, rejects the Biden administration's contention that the HEROES Act gives them the power to waive these legal provisions, saying that effort to waive here does not remotely resemble how it has been on prior occasions. So they're saying it doesn't rise to the level of the HEROES Act. That, again, was for 9/11. That's the response for it. So this is all about the authority, this decision, it looks like, the authority for the president to do this type of thing going forward.
All right, Edward, let me get back to Nicholas Giordano. Nicholas, this doesn't come as a surprise, to your point. You expected this. Do you think at some point these borrowers, some 26 million, had signed up for this program? Do you think they're going to not end up having to pay?
When students sign a contract, they are committing to an obligation to repay those loans. As of right now, they're going to have to repay them. Unless Congress comes up with a plan to forgive student debt, it's going to continue to go through the court system and be knocked down. But again, what we need to focus on is actually tackling the cost of college education and promote the viable alternatives so that students don't fall into the debt trap. This is a one-time deal that President Biden was trying to do, and all it did was it keeps the problem going on longer without holding the institutions accountable for continually increasing the cost of tuition.
Yeah, I mean, is this the tipping point? We've long complained about the cost of higher education. It's gotten out of control. Is it some moment like this that maybe, just maybe, we'll get some reform?
Well, let's be honest. I mean, this is a bailout. It would be a bailout to the higher education institutions themselves.
Right.
So maybe this will actually force them to rethink their approach to how they charge college tuition. Maybe that they'll be more likely to fiscal responsibility and return on investment depending on what you're majoring in. I mean, you shouldn't take out $100,000 in student loans to be a teacher or a police officer. And those are the messages that we need to put out to reach the student body and to reach the parents out there.
Well, reform is most definitely needed. Nicholas, thank you. And again, the U.S. Supreme Court on a vote of 6-3 along ideological lines. A basic.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.